This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
But I think we have to get on the same page first about what does help mean in this person's situation? What are they trying to accomplish? For some people, for example, putting them on a ventilator just to give them another day or two of life, we might consider futile because they're going to die anyway. From a patient's point of view, if that day or two is all it takes to get their family to the bedside because they live out of town so they can say goodbye, maybe that's not futile to them. Maybe that's everything to them.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. I'm talking with hospice and palliative physician Dr. Matthew Tyler about how to engage your medical team in conversations about what matters most to you. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice podcast is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode is sponsored by GrandPad. GrandPad is the all-in-one tablet designed especially for senior adults. With GrandPad, you get safe, simple video calling and photo sharing. Users can create a private family network that allows for secure photo and video sharing. The GrandPad utilizes a simple format that allows seniors to enjoy games, music, email, and more. Visit our special GrandPad website designed exclusively for the Heart of Hospice listeners at grandpad.net/THOH.
My guest, Dr. Matthew Tyler, is a physician board certified in internal medicine as well as hospice and palliative medicine. He currently works as the medical director of palliative care services in Illinois, and he works full-time providing specialty care for patients in the hospital and in the clinic. Matthew also runs a service called How to Train Your Doctor, which is devoted to educating the public on topics related to palliative care, clinical communication, and more. His content is available on howtotrainyourdoctor.com, and you can find his videos on Instagram and YouTube. Dr. Tyler started an Instagram account that has blown up in ways that he wasn't even expecting. He's got over 32,000 followers now. His mission is to help healthcare consumers learn how to be effective advocates for themselves and their family members. We discussed some of the hot button topics that he posts on his Instagram account, including things like doctors who are telling patients and families that any further treatment is futile, how we address feeding tubes, how we talk about CPR. And Dr. Tyler also explains what he calls false choices and how that impacts the care of patients. There's some great content here. I learned from him. I think you're going to learn too. So here's my conversation with Dr. Matthew Tyler. Welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be a wonderful conversation. I have been looking forward to this all day. Your content is fantastic, and we're going to talk about how I found you because that's going to be a focus of what we're talking about today. But I want to start out with an icebreaker question that I didn't share with you.
Okay.
And this is from the End of Life deck. If you're familiar with the death deck.
I have an end-of-life.
Yes. I love this one. It's great for end-of-life teams to use to start meaningful conversations with people facing serious and life-limiting illness. So I picked one out for you, and we'll just see what you come up with.
All right.
So this is about a eulogy. It says, who doesn't love a good eulogy? Start yours today by sharing one piece of advice for those left behind. So what would be your one piece of advice you would like to share inside your eulogy?
Oh man, we're getting very deep very quickly, aren't we?
That's very reflective.
I think for the folks that are hopefully attending my party when I die, I would like to share with all those folks there that they are good enough as they are.
Oh man, they are good enough as they are. That's awesome. That is awesome. Maybe we should have saved that for the very end of the podcast because that's great. I love it. I love it. So let's talk about the work that you're doing. I have to tell you that I'm completely jealous of your Instagram account. You have over 32,000 followers on your Insta account.
It's been a ride.
Yeah. Yeah. So congratulations. That's a great following. What's your content?
So my content ultimately is just all things under the umbrella of hospice and palliative care. And really the origin was from a very common thing that I would hear at the bedside of patients and caregivers, which is I would finish a consult with them as a palliative care clinician in the hospital. And as we always do at the end of the consult, we say, hey, what questions do you have right now? And so commonly, the patient or their family member would say, you know what? I have no idea what I should be asking right now. And I really wanted to offer something to the world to work through that common phenomenon, because at the bedside we can work through that. I can reflect with them about everything that we've talked about so far and maybe offer a thing or two that we haven't talked about that maybe we should, or I can provide reassurance that, you know what, it's normal to feel like you're missing something. It's normal to second guess or doubt your plans. And I really wanted to bring that type of reassurance and education to scale in a way that you can really only do with the power of the internet and social media. So that was sort of the inspiration behind the channel too. And it's just been, one little pearl after another, whether that's about feeding tubes and their limitations, or about what it means to talk about CPR at the end of life, or just getting people educated about what palliative care is and empowering them to ask their doctors for palliative care.
So your, I won't even say organization, but the work that you're doing, you call How to Train Your Doctor.
Yeah.
It's all about empowering people who are consuming healthcare or advocating for someone who's having to consume healthcare to basically get their doctor, I hate to say in line, but to train the doctor on how to take care of them in the best way that the patient needs, which is so important because advocacy is a huge thing for us these days in the system we're working in. So why do you think that it's so important to educate patients and families to navigate their own healthcare when we've got educational systems set up for physicians? Why do you think it's so important to educate patients and families?
Yeah, so we do have some systems set up in healthcare, but I would add to that they're incredibly fragmented, and just navigating the system, for anyone who's had to do it, they know it's a complete dumpster fire. Trying to actually get what you need when you need it is a heavy lift. And the sort of education that doctors get about navigating the healthcare system is just it's incomplete, and that's not through the fault of the doctors or anyone else. It's just we don't get trained in navigating just insurance systems or all the therapy services, and we certainly don't get adequate training in having really difficult, complicated conversations about healthcare choices, especially when there are multiple reasonable pathways that you could go down that are heavily dependent on an individual's preferences and values and priorities, sort of what we call their goals of care in medical jargon.
Right.
And that's where kind of, again, where the videos come into place. They wanted to give people something to help educate about what their options are, what the resources are that their doctors may not have thought about, and would be certainly happy to connect patients to those resources. It's just not something that comes to top of mind because doctors have a ton of demands. I mean, it's a grind, and I don't none of what I do is meant to be a knock on doctors in general. It's just that they have an incredibly taxing amount of things at front of mind to get through in a very short amount of time. And if there's something that's important to you as a patient, you just have to speak up, is the reality.
Well, I think there's an expectation for physicians to be comforters and clinicians and knowledgeable and experts and know the latest technology and basically to be everything to every single patient. That's too much to ask of an individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just too much. Yeah. Okay. So I love your videos. They're short. They're accessible because they're on Instagram. They are easy to understand. And you're tackling some of the most, I don't want to say controversial, but some of the most painful points where patients and caregivers are making decisions. Feeding tubes, CPR. So I want to pick on one because we had a message, I commented on it, about what you had called the medical F word, futility. I really like that because it's a term that we use basically to say that this treatment is not going to be effective. It more than likely will make things worse. But that's not what we tell people. We say it's medically futile. It's useless.
Yeah.
So you and I were talking about how that word is really not a useful term to use when you're talking to caregivers and patients. Why do you think that particular term is so detrimental to our conversations?
I think futility, it's a tricky word. Often I hear it used, maybe not deliberately so, but it can come off as sort of accusatory or even sort of like shame-driven, implying that a patient or caregiver wants something that would harm a loved one is just not a constructive conversation. I think it also very much is dependent on what you would call futile. When we talk about futility, it's like you said, this is not going to help. But I think we have to get on the same page first about what does help mean in this person's situation? What are they trying to accomplish? For some people, for example, putting them on a ventilator just to give them another day or two of life, we might consider futile because they're going to die anyway. From a patient's point of view, if that day or two is all it takes to get their family to the bedside because they live out of town so they can say goodbye, maybe that's not futile to them. Maybe that's everything to them. So I think it's just far more constructive to talk about what this intervention will do and what it won't do, and decide, does that fall within the scope of what a meaningful outcome would be for this person so we can get on the same page.
What do you think caregivers hear when that term is used?
I think they just feel shut down. It's sort of the beginning and end of a conversation. Say, oh, we're not going to do that. That's futile. And I think like I said, it can, and yeah, a little dismissive. I think a little bit just like shaming sometimes. And again, I think it comes from a good place because no physician wants to do something that would harm their patient. We want to be good stewards of resources. We don't want to do things that would not benefit our patients. But I do think we got to pause and figure out what is this person trying to accomplish before we jump in with the F word there.
Yeah, the F word. I like that. The word that comes to my mind is wasteful. Wasteful. Yeah. And I wonder sometimes if patients and families think it would be a waste to do this. It would be a waste to expend this procedure, this money, this time, this effort on your particular loved one. What would you say to that?
I think that, certainly with insurance sort of being the eye that's ever watching all of us and kind of pulling the strings, I've certainly on a fairly regular basis hear comments from patients and families that, oh, you're discharging us because insurance won't pay you anymore. A lot of what we do, I think there are these undertones that it's a financial matter, and that's a tricky thing because it's not entirely true, but it's not entirely false either. and walking that line so that you don't, you don't want to be dishonest about the financial aspects that drive some decisions or pressure to make decisions. But also there's medical decision making in there too. And I think we got to be clear about what's medically indicated, what's it going to accomplish, and hope that the rapport that you've built along the way, that they're going to trust you when you make a recommendation about something that will help or not for this particular individual.
That's true. We have to acknowledge that the financial piece does influence what we do, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully
Yeah.
it doesn't influence everything that we do, but it's definitely there.
Yeah.
You are educating so that patients and families get care that's a good fit. The communication's there, the trust is built, and they have a good understanding, and they get what they need from their physicians. Tell me about a time when you saw a family get care that was not a good fit.
Yeah, so I'll tell a story that I hope highlights the nuances of how palliative care can be helpful, and that sort of breaks the stereotypes that often get projected on palliative care. Because this was a situation where a patient was getting care that was presumed to be a bad fit by the medical team, when in fact actually wasn't. This was a woman who was coming in and out of the hospital with exacerbations of heart failure. So she had swelling in the legs, difficulty breathing, get admitted to get IV diuretics to get that fluid off, the whole deal with heart failure exacerbations. And this was happening multiple times over the months leading up to this hospitalization prior to when we met her. And our palliative care team got this consult to talk to this woman about, we call her goals of care, which is essentially what doctors say when they think a person's plan of care isn't as good as it could be. And they want us to talk about maybe changing that plan of care to one that's more conservative or comfort focused. So that's what we did. We met this woman and got a sense of who she was as a person and what was important to her. And part of that is figuring out who are the important people in her life, where she's living and all that. And come to find out that she lived at home with her daughter. And she did, in fact, know that she was super sick. And she did, in fact, know that she was very near the end of her life. And she was actually banking on that because she very much did not want to die at home. This whole notion that we were going to get her to agree to home with hospice was just completely wrong from the start. That she was coming into the hospital for every exacerbation because she, at the end of the day, hoped she would die in the hospital of one of these hospitalizations, because she was terrified of her house to her daughter being the place that mom died. And she didn't want to taint the safety of their home by being the place where she died. And so it turned out, after talking to her, that she actually was getting care that was the best fit for her, just that the healthcare team was presuming that it wasn't, because that's the common narrative, right? Is that we're supposed to want to go home and have home hospice and die at home. And while that's true for many, many people, there are a sizable minority of people for whom that just doesn't make sense for personal or medical complexity reasons.
Absolutely. It's that concept of a good death.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which we all assume. Yeah. I think healthcare people, especially hospice people, assume that a good death is the patient died at home peacefully with symptoms managed and the family at bedside, grieving appropriately.
Yeah. Right.
But a good death is what the patient decides it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for this particular woman, she didn't explicitly say, I don't want to die at home. So every time I go into a crisis, I make sure I get here. So if my death happens, it's in the hospital. She didn't explicitly communicate that to her team, at least not at first.
I would say no one asked her until we met her. No one really explored what was happening, what she thought about it, until we sat down and talked about it with her on the palliative care team.
Did she realize it? Was this something she was doing intentionally?
Oh, yeah.
So she had this wish. She just didn't express it. Do you think that patients and families are a lot of times passive participants in their health care that they're receiving?
I would say yes, although I would say it's not deliberate. Most friends and family that I talk to honestly come at this with the presumption of their doctor knows best. And I think it's great to trust that your physician has good medical judgment. But again, this ties back into the navigation of the healthcare system and what doctors are trained to be experts in and what they weren't trained to be experts in. We were just having dinner with friends last night and talking about how absurd it was that you take your dog to the vet for a procedure and they can tell you up front, this is what it's going to cost you. And meanwhile, if you go to your doctor for a procedure and say, what's it going to cost me? They have no idea.
Right.
Because with insurance and everything else in the back end, like we just don't know this. And that's not a failure of medical training per se, but it's certainly not part of medical training. It's not medicine per se, but it certainly impacts the delivery of medicine and the ramifications on the patients that we take care of. So I think to your point about are we passive participants or not, it's not as a layperson just not realizing how fragmented the healthcare system is until you're really in it, until things get complicated. That's when you realize that you do have to be a strong advocate and speak up for what you feel like is missing, rather than presume that things are going to get brought up when they're relevant, because the reality is a lot of times they don't.
Yeah. I know with caregivers, it's so important that they disclose to the physician, their own personal physicians, hey, I'm a caregiver, because it impacts the care that they receive, because it's a job. I think a lot of caregivers come at it in slow increments, and it builds, and they learn to take on each piece as an advocate and have those conversations, and they learn the systems. But for other caregivers where there's an acute event, this goes back to, we don't even know what to ask. We don't know what we don't know. It's drinking from the fire hose. They've been blasted with a severe stroke, a significant cardiac event, and all of a sudden, all of the questions need to be asked right then. It's not a trickle in of need, which just makes that relationship with the physician so much more complicated.
And to add to that, I think it's especially complicated when you're the caregiver of a patient who is, medically speaking, decisional, meaning they can take in information and they can make decisions on their own. But for caregivers that are very intimately involved in the day-to-day care and support of that person, it's very easy for them to get boxed out, because the medical team just focuses on that. Is the patient decisional? If so, we're going to talk to them. We're going to ask them questions and not necessarily bring in their circle of supports or even their one most important person, despite how integral that person is in their day-to-day lives and in their healthcare delivery plan.
Well, most of the decisions that someone with a life-limiting illness is making, they don't make those decisions in a vacuum. They're getting input from their caregiver, and the decisions that they make affect the caregiver. May affect care decisions that the caregiver has to make later on down the road when the patient's no longer able to voice wishes and decisions. I am loving this conversation, but we're going to take a break right now. There's more to come.
If you're looking for an easy solution to stay connected to your older loved ones, GrandPad is everything you need. It's the all-in-one tablet designed especially for seniors. With GrandPad, you get safe, simple video calling and photo sharing to connect the whole family. The GrandPad utilizes a simple format that allows seniors to enjoy games, music, email, and more. GrandPad comes with 4G LTE cellular service already included, so there's no need for Wi-Fi. Users can create a private family network that allows for secure photo and video sharing. At the core of the GrandPad team are the Grand Advisors, a group of seniors that continually inspire, test, and guide the development of GrandPad. The company has built a platform that empowers seniors of all ages and technological skills to safely connect with family, friends, and caregivers. No spam, no robocalls, only connections with those you trust. The GrandPad team strives to create a world where no senior is lonely or isolated. It's the smart choice to keep older adults connected. Visit our website today at grandpad.net/THOH or call 1-888-904-4723. GrandPad, keeping seniors connected.
Your videos really key into some of those hot button issues. So I want to talk about feeding tubes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're laughing because we know this is so hard.
Yeah.
Why are feeding tubes and that particular decision about artificial nutrition, let's call it what it is, why is that decision, in your experience, in your thoughts, why is that decision so hard for people?
Oh man. Yeah. So we'll go a couple different directions on this way, because you're right. Anytime I talk about nutrition, anything, feeding tubes, these tend to get a lot of comments. And I would say, I mean, for one thing, it impacts everyone at some point. I mean, the nutrition piece of a serious illness, most every serious progressive illness, once you get to those last weeks, months of life, people are going to stop eating as much, stop drinking as much, and losing weight. So it's a common shared experience for a lot of people who take care of someone who's at the end of their life. Plus, it's very it's a hot button with just culture, and food is social, food is love, food is so intimately tied into how we deliver care to people that we love, not just medical care, but just how we show love to one another. And it's very hard to see someone not eat, because I think deep down, not even deep down, people just know if you don't eat, you're going to die.
Right.
That's the rally cry of everyone is you got to eat or you're going to die. And flipping that around to get people of the mindset that they're not eating because they're dying, that's a big mindset shift. And it takes a lot of resistance to get through this idea that the lack of nutrition isn't the problem. We often just presume you pour in the calories and they're going to be fine, when it's something just much more fundamental and deep in the body that's changing the ability to use food and nutrition. And if you haven't dealt with this day in and day out for years, it's hard to really see things that way, and it just doesn't fit your typical model for how the rest of life is played out for yourself and for the person you're taking care of. So yes, it's a difficult issue just for the social piece of it. The other challenge with feeding tube education is touches on the other F word that I often talk about, which is false choice. Feeding tubes, I still see how clinicians bring this mindset to decisions about feeding tubes. Of it's either, if you want to live as long as possible, do the feeding tube, but if you just want to focus on comfort and quality of life, then don't do the feeding tube. When we have plenty of data to show that is a false choice. It really doesn't matter what your quote goals of care are. Feeding tubes have never been shown to prolong life when you have advanced dementia or really any progressive illness. Other than, I think, ALS is the only one that's really got decent data behind it as life prolonging when it comes to feeding tube placement. And this especially grinds me, and why I talk about it a lot, because caregivers and patients have to make enough really difficult, emotionally laden decisions. I would really love it if we stop giving them false choices that make things sound and feel even harder than they need to be. But there's just a lot of clinicians out there that still cling on to this idea that, well, if this person wants to live as long as possible, I guess we'll do the feeding tube. I wish we could move out of that space and just talk about the data and provide the emotional support and go from there.
Do you think it's easier not to have that particular conversation? Are we avoiding a little bit?
Yeah. I think we are. Ultimately, it's for the most part a fee-for-service world still, and that you can spend less time and get more money to do the feeding tube, which is the path of least resistance, than it is to coordinate a family meeting and sit down and have a hard talk. And maybe get yelled at or have emotions run high. It can often be just the easier thing gets better compensation for. I mean, that's a losing proposition in healthcare every time.
Yeah, you're poking the bear.
Yeah.
The minute you say we need to have a family conference about this, and we'd like to bring in the social worker, and we'd like to have the chaplain, and the doctor's going to be there with you, you just need to be ready for it, because it's a really emotionally volatile situation. So would you say the same thing's true about IV hydration at end of life?
For the most part, yes. IV hydration, there are some studies that show it can be mildly life prolonging by a day or two, depending on the person's terminal diagnosis. But by and large, it tends to do more harm than good. It's especially in that it can cause more issues with difficulty breathing in the last days of life, which touches on the number one fear that people have, which is the fear of suffocation at the end of life. And when most people hear that, they really don't want fluids. But it does tie back into this very emotionally laden decision to, are we sacrificing quality? Or are we going to sacrifice time? And I think for most people, it's helpful to just focus on the fact that it's probably not going to really prolong life, and it's probably going to make the time less comfortable. But I think IV nutrition, or IV hydration rather, that does warrant a bit more of a nuanced conversation for the individual, because there are some instances where it might make sense as a trial. And this is where I would love to see our healthcare delivery model for end-of-life care be a little bit more nimble than our current hospice model, because I think we do tend to, we come at a lot of things as a very, very binary, like IV hydration is universally bad, or IV nutrition is universally bad. And I think we do have to be humble about what the data says and what the data doesn't say, and be willing to approach these conversations with an open mind and consider doing trials of things if it's the difference between getting holistic wraparound care at end of life or not. But that's hard to do when, again, finances play a role in that too. And how much resources that hospice has to work with you on more nuanced things. So I'd like to see our hospice model get updated to provide a bit more flexibility that reflects the complexity of care that's being delivered these days.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a whole different tangent.
Oh, I'm telling you, that might be another podcast by itself.
Yeah.
So if you were teaching a family about palliative care, what are 3 things you would want people to know?
Well, the main one, the number one by a country mile, is that palliative care provides support alongside your other treatments. So there's no either or when it comes to palliative care or chemotherapy, or palliative care or a transplant. Palliative care is there to provide support focused on giving you the best quality of life possible, no matter what the rest of your treatment is. Which is why I enjoy telling that story about the woman with heart failure that was coming into the hospital, because ultimately we did not advocate that she go home with hospice, which is what everyone thought we were going to do, but we advocated that she stay in the hospital for as long as possible. But that's certainly number one for palliative care, and that ties into number 2, which is we're going to advocate for whatever is most important to you, whether that's living as long as humanly possible within the scope of medicine, or keeping you as comfortable as possible, regardless of how much time that means. We're gonna talk about what's important to you and build a medical plan around that. And number 3 would be that still doctors often don't think to offer palliative care, but most are receptive to referring out to palliative care if you ask for it. But many times you do have to be, as the patient or the caregiver, the one to ask your doctor, hey, I'd like to get palliative care involved right now.
Yeah. Advocacy for yourself. And it's a hard thing. I think there are a lot of hospice folks that have been in the business for a while, hospice clinicians, nurses like me, that aren't as familiar with palliative care and exactly what it can do. So I think that offer doesn't get provided as often as it should.
Yeah. And part of why I am so gung-ho about showing these videos is that I think a lot of docs still presume palliative care and hospice are the same thing. And I've seen and heard stories of patients who will ask for palliative care and the doctor will say, oh, like we're not there yet, or no, we still have a lot more to do. And you do sometimes have to push back and say, hey, doc, I'm not asking for hospice. I'm asking for extra support alongside this other treatment, and to provide a little education to the doctor in that case. But unless you're savvy enough to realize what's happening in that moment, a lot of folks will just get shot down and just back off.
Right. They just ride along with whatever's being given.
Yeah, and they'll miss out on a lot of great support because of it.
So I want to ask you a reflective question. We're getting close to being done, but I want to ask you, for you, what do you think has been the greatest gift that you've experienced of working with people who are at end of life?
I would say by far the greatest gift are the many, many times that I'm told thank you. That one just always hits me right in the heart and soul. Every time we have a really hard conversation, so many times I've had to tell someone, you're dying, or your loved one is dying. I think there's just this common presumption that we're going to get yelled at, or that there's just going to be like just resentment or anger in response to that. And that is just so rare compared to the number of times that someone will say, just thank you for being honest about that. Thank you for telling me that. That's I'm very grateful for that, and the gift and validation that provides for me.
That's wonderful. I love it. We get those moments where people push back, and we do get to see the worst side of people in a lot of situations, but seeing that gratitude makes all the difference, doesn't it?
100%.
Yeah. Okay. So, how to train your doctor. Where can listeners watch your videos? Check it out, because, if you're interested in feeding tubes, you have questions about how to talk to somebody about CPR, which was a great video.
Speaking of a hot button,
Yeah, speaking of a hot button issue, we should talk about that, because CPR or not to do CPR, that's a huge thing. So let's take time to talk about that before we close.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, you made that video. That's a big deal. That is a big deal.
Yeah.
What's been your experience with that? What prompted you to make the video on that one?
So that video was a response video to another one I'd made, where I was this palliative care fairy, kind of walking around the hospital and kind of correcting.
I saw that one.
Yeah, there were, let's call them suboptimal conversations happening in the hospital, and I would come with my magic wand and it would say palliative care, and then they redo the conversation in a way that was a bit more patient-centered. And in one of those suboptimal conversations, there was a doctor talking to someone about breaking grandma's ribs if they attempt CPR. And in the palliative care version, the doctor instead says, I'm worried that time for grandma is getting short, and let's talk about what's most important to her. And I got a lot of pushback on that, saying that, like people need to hear the rib thing. It's brutally honest, and we don't want to be breaking ribs. And I made this response video saying, look, like, no, like the rib thing is stupid. And the reason is because if all it took to save this person's life was breaking their ribs, like that's a ridiculous comparison, right? Like if you were to come to me as a doctor and say, would you rather be dead or have some broken ribs? I'd say, well, just break as many ribs as you need to save my life.
Right. But, it'll heal.
But yes, but obviously that's not the point. The point is that CPR wouldn't work. And I think because, again, tying back to the very little training, if any, that we get about talking about this very hard stuff that doctors have, they fall back on the rib breaking thing, because it's certainly graphic and it's certainly brutal. And I think we kind of fall back on this like shame and fear-based tactic to get people to agree to what is honestly the best possible thing, which is the DNR for people that wouldn't survive it, but in a not very patient-centered way. So I made a response video that talked about why the rib thing was just not the best approach to talking about CPR. And there were some folks that still doubled down on it, that felt like people needed to hear this. And there was this hilarious faction of it was a minority, but there was a vocal minority of folks who clearly just watched the first half of the video, where I compare the NFL player who arrested on the field last year,
Right.
yeah, Hamlin, and I talked about how there was no doctor like saying like, wait, like we're gonna break his ribs, like don't intervene. And there were folks who like just clearly watched to that point of the video and said, you can't compare a football player to a 98-year-old grandma, like a completely different situation. And I was like, no, yeah, like I know that's literally the point of the video, is to say these are two different situations, and one CPR is indicated and one CPR is not indicated. And that's really what the conversation should boil down to. And if grandma dies, it's because she's at the end of her life because of illness. CPR is not indicated. If an NFL player rests on the field, he's otherwise healthy. Like, we should absolutely intervene with CPR.
Right.
But that point somehow was lost on a lot of people, which was just a bizarre time for me.
You know, social media is what it is. But broken ribs are the least of grandma's problems, is what it comes down to.
Right. Let's talk about what's going on with grandma big picture, and
right,
what's important to her, and where all this fits in. Because honestly, the code status and CPR is, I almost say, an afterthought in most of my conversations. When we talk about person's illness and big picture prognosis and goals, it's very clear what the proper code status is for this person. And it's, once we've decided that we want to focus on comfort, allowing nature to run its natural course, it's very natural then to say, well, look, most people in your situation also want us to just focus on comfort at the end of life without intervening with life support and chest compression. So that would reflect it as a DNR code status. Does that sound okay? And most people are like, oh yeah, like totally, that totally makes sense. But that it's a much easier conversation if you focused on the big picture and the goals in the context of the big picture, rather than just narrowly focusing on CPR in a vacuum as if it's just going to happen out of the blue, because obviously it won't happen out of the blue. When you're having a goals of care conversation, something clearly is already wrong with the person.
Well, and CPR doesn't fix any end-stage disease.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And we forget about that.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, it's those are the big, you want to push buttons with people, those are the big decision-making, life-altering, life-ending decisions that people have to deal with, and you just have to know how to talk about them well. So that's what your videos do. So how can listeners find the videos, check them out, see the comments and the feedback that people are offering? Because there's really a lot of good conversation going along with your videos.
Yeah, thank you. So most of my videos, especially the shorter ones, are on Instagram at How to Train Your Doctor. I do take some deeper dives into some topics on YouTube as well at the same handle, How to Train Your Doctor. And you can always just jump on my website, howtotrainyourdoctor.com. That's got links to everything there. And if you do check out my website, there is a free, what I call Goals of Care Jumpstarter, which is just a one-page PDF that gives you a couple conversational prompts to help you initiate a goals of care conversation with your doctor, which essentially boils down to, let's talk about what's going on. When would we reassess what my priorities with my healthcare are? And, this is the person that I want involved in my decisions, like a spouse or a brother or a child, whatever. Kind of gives you the highlights that would get you really head and shoulders above most folks as far as talking to your doctor about what's most important.
Yeah, it's a great download. I already downloaded it and had a look at it.
Thanks.
Super easy to use. So thank you so much for training us on how to train our doctors. It's a huge asset to be able to communicate, and just keep doing the good work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on.
Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the Heart of Hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.